If you clicked on this video, you're a nerd, which means I already like you. I want to look at some fantasy maps with you and place them on this fairly arbitrary tier list. I quickly want to go over what these tiers are so we can all be on the same page. S tier is reserved for pure perfection, or as close as you can come to it, flawed as we are. Anything I will put in A is great, and B is still good. C is where things start to get kinda meh, but still passable. I called it okay. D stands for bad, and I don't think we will need anything lower than that, 'cause nothing should be so terrible that it needs a tier worse than simply bad. All good? Okay, let's get right into it then. Let's start with the fantasy map that pretty much inspired any high fantasy coming after it, Middle-earth. We can see the western part of a bigger landmass with the sea to the west. There's more land towards the east and south that isn't shown. This is very typical for fantasy maps. However, this was the first one, so you could call it a trendsetter. Design-wise, I'm not the biggest fan of the red used. However, it does do some world building by implying maps in Middle-earth are drawn using these colors. I always imagined Bilbo scribbling notes onto his maps with red ink. This might be far-fetched, but it counts as world building in my head. Still, I don't like the aesthetics of it, which is totally subjective, so if you disagree, that's fair. Without the red, it might be too boring, 'cause the rest of it is just black and white. Another design choice I don't like is the way the ocean and seas are done. These lines look more like some optical illusion out of a comic book than actual water to me. I think it works well in this body of water in Mordor down here, because the lines are smaller and relatively round, but the more jagged they get due to irregular coastlines, the uglier it gets. Again, this is totally just my preference. I love how the mountain ranges are done, just black with white spaces to create shape and plasticity. I also really like this big mountain range coming down south, and this somewhat connected one splitting up down here. I loved looking at this map as a kid while reading The Hobbit or watching Lord of the Rings and seeing the journey these characters took. If you do this, you realize just how many names and details are cramped into this, to where you really have to zoom in or look close to appreciate all of it. From afar, it can make the map look a little cramped, because there's so many things written on it, but I can't blame it too much for that, 'cause I'm a nerd who loves being able to look at all those small things. Something that helps alleviate this cramped feeling a little is the fact that there are no borders between different kingdoms or nations, which is somewhat unusual for a fantasy map, but actually more accurate to the political realities of a medieval-inspired setting where borders were rarely as well defined as they are today. You have to think more in line with vague spheres of influences than strict borders, and I like that. Sometimes, natural borders help define different kingdoms. Like these mountains here pretty clearly divide Rohan and Gondor, though where exactly in those mountains the border is, if anywhere, remains unclear. Some aspects of the map look rather designed. For example, the mountains around Mordor almost build a perfect wall around it. This doesn't have to be negative, although it might look unnatural. But plenty of things in the real world look unnatural and yet are real. Also, this kinda makes you wonder what's being protected behind these mountains. And once you're far enough into the story to realize that that's where our protagonists are headed, it helps visualize how difficult it would be to get in there. Quickly hitting on the names of places, these are overwhelmingly great to perfect. Some sound a bit too made up for my ears. However, Tolkien was a linguist, and I'm not going to argue against him so far outside my own field of expertise. Some people criticize names like Mount Doom as too on the nose, but I think it makes a lot of sense. Humans aren't always the most inspired when it comes to naming things, and even the things that sound unique in our real world often have very mundane meanings in their original language. It certainly beats naming every second town after Columbus, like the Americans like to do. Lastly, the map does look a lot emptier in the east, which is a little weird. Of course, this helps guide the eyes to the places that are actually important to the story. Also, this can again be seen as subtle world-building insofar as the people making this map might have not known as much about these regions, or simply didn't place much importance on them. So this is only a minor point. Overall, I like this map a lot. I would put it in perfect if some of the design vibed a bit more with me. There are other interpretations of this map that make it look far better in my eyes. However, we are rating the original one from the books. I even thought about putting it in B, but that seemed too harsh. It is still a great map, and I will always love obsessing over the little details within it. So it goes in A, though it might be on the lower end of it. We will have to see where the others end up. While we're on the topic of Tolkien, I wanted to throw in this little map from The Hobbit too. Obviously, this is not exactly a fair comparison. I know that a lot more work can be put into a world map than one like this. However, we are talking about Tolkien here. He put work into everything, and it also shows here. We have runes to the left, which is already more unique than most fantasy maps who just spell everything out in English. The compass in the corner here is also labeled with runes, and if you pay attention to the map, you can actually see that up is not north here, rather up is east and down is west. I do believe this was customary in many medieval maps from Christian Europe too, putting the paradise that was said to be in the east at the top of the map. Through this, we already learn that the people who made this map have unique runes and a way to make maps that differs from ours. Now, while this is unique, and I like it a lot in this map, there is a reason that it's not done much in fantasy maps. It's simply confusing for the reader. Even Tolkien seemed to know that, because his big map of Middle-earth is pointed up north. However, for a little dwarven map like this, I think it's a great touch of uniqueness. This isn't even spelled out to you if you just glance at it, because the compass is labeled with these runes that we don't understand, so we might just assume this rune stands for north. Only by looking at the map closer can we actually see this, and that realization can be a cool little moment for the reader. I like this a lot. The colors are a lot more soothing to my eyes. The red sticks out less and is used only sparingly for the dragon, which is fitting, and the runes, which are worth to be drawn attention towards. The artwork here is wonderful. You see the big mountain as the obvious goal, and the dragon guarding it. The water is done well, and the only empty space on the map is supposed to be empty because it was desolated by the dragon, as you can see by its name. Even then, there are dead trees drawn to hint at the destruction. There are annotations for what lies in each direction to help place this map within the larger world the reader might already know about. The Lonely Mountain itself is both in name and concept a great creation. The idea of one big mountain in the middle of a flat land evokes something mysterious in me, and while it might not be the most realistic, I think that's perfectly fine for a fantasy map. It makes me think of a big volcano that periodically erupts and turns everything to ash. Those living under it live in its shadow, constantly afraid of the time it will awaken. But just like a volcano that turns land fertile, so does this mountain hold the potential to make its surrounding lands prosper. It only has to be conquered first, and for that, you need to overcome your fear of the fire. I really love this map, and while you might say it's not fair to some bigger maps, I say sometimes less is more. This is perfect for what it is, and that's where I'm putting it. Next up is Wheel of Time, which is a few decades younger than the world from Lord of the Rings. Again, we see a west coast, and again it is basically one big block of land with slight curves added through the coastline. Now, this version uses color, although the ones printed in my books have always been black and white. Other than that, these are the same though. Design-wise, I like the way the oceans are done here. You can see water and a lot of clouds or mist above it, which still communicates that this is water through the colors used. I like the little details, like the ship here, or the way text is written on these strips here, and the decorations surrounding them. Obviously, we have this symbol of the snake and the wheel, which is seen in the story, and I like the way it's done here a lot. Unfortunately, I can't praise the continent in the same way. I think the greens used don't make for the most appealing visuals, though I appreciate seeing how different colors indicate different biomes. You can imagine yellow and brown being sandy or rocky, and the darker greens being deeper forests. In that way, the mixing of the colors works insofar as they give information in an intuitive way, but I again just don't vibe with it too much. This yellowish green without much else makes it seem rather mushy. What I like is the way these mountains are done, especially up north. It looks kind of washed out and almost smudged, like the land itself got reshaped by bigger forces. It also evokes feelings of mist lying over these parts, and makes the area seem mysterious and hidden. I do like having only big cities marked red. That way, the color stands out and is a good marker for truly important places. Similarly to Middle-earth, this map has a lot of details where you basically need to zoom in if you want to really read all of the names and see how streets connect and how rivers flow. I like that. It gives nerds like me something to keep busy on a rainy afternoon. Just like the whole land mass shown is basically one big square, so is this area here, entangled by mountains, which can look a little unnatural. However, it is also used to guide the viewer's eyes into the middle part of the map, with the outer regions being framed as less important or harder to get to. The only thing really breaking up these plains is this mountain range here, which again is just a straight line and doesn't help much with the feeling of blockiness, and it makes this whole area feel rather samey. Again, the color palette adds to this too. The only shape on this map that really stands out is this little island here. It looks a little like a fish to me, but not so much that it seems designed. More like the way humans see shapes in stars and land masses in the real world. They never match perfectly, but good enough to evoke our pattern recognition. I can imagine stories about this fish island within the lore just by looking at it, and I like that, whether it was intentional or not. Overall, though, this map doesn't feel very special to me. There are aspects I like, and that alone could land it in good. However, with the almost generic feeling of shapes and colors, I will have to say that the Wheel of Time map is just okay. Next, we have the map from A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. This is the first big map that we're looking at that isn't just a west coast of a big blob of land. Although it also keeps going in the east and we don't see where it ends, just like with the previous ones. The same happens towards the north over here, though, and I think that fits the narrative very well. You have ice and fire coming together, and both of those regions end somewhere in the unknown, shrouded in mystery and legend. But looking at just the map itself now, I like the design. It's also very green in some regions, but I think the color blending is far less harsh on the eyes compared to our previous map. You can identify the biomes of each region very easily, and I think that's good. The colors look very modern. You might see the same color coding used in modern maps, which helps the viewer, but can also make it feel less like a medieval fantasy to some people. However, I think there are enough deviations to still carry across that fantastical setting. A few other things stand out, like these dark purple areas which hint at some kind of supernatural, maybe evil force shaping these lands. I like how the map ends with it over here, and gets even darker down here before it cuts off, implying that there might be a center of this force that we really don't know much about at all. I like how there's a Red Sea over here, which is actually colored red. This is something that was done in the real world in Europe. For quite a while, the Red Sea in our world was actually colored red on a lot of maps. Obviously, this is a fantastical setting, and it might be literally red, but it could also be a translation error or just a myth in this world. That's another thing that is interesting about this map. It reflects what the people of Westeros know about the world, not what is actually in it. So the farther east you go, the more unreliable it gets, and that's also the area where we see a lot of more fantastical things pop up, like this dark land down here, or the Bleeding Sea. The unreliable narrator element of this map makes it more realistic, and also, to me at least, a lot more interesting and fascinating. Now, I haven't said much about the shapes of the continents yet, and that's because they are kind of uninspired. Westeros is just Great Britain upside down with Ireland glued to it, and Essos reminds me a lot of a huge version of Turkey. Essos especially is basically just one big rectangle. Now again, this could just be because the people drawing this map didn't know the exact coastlines, and so they made it look rather blocky. That's what a lot of historical maps show too. The less details we know about a land, the less nuanced we are about it. But even with that theory in mind, it doesn't make for the most exciting-looking map. Westeros has a lot more bays carved out of it, with the north being inspired by Scotland, and Westeros as a whole inspired by English and European feudalism. I don't think it's the worst thing to base its shape on the British Isles. However, I think changing a few more things would have been better, to maybe get to a shape where the connections you make are more subconscious than literal. Still, I think it works, and it does imply that this is far bigger than Britain in our world, ranging from an Arctic region all the way down to a desert. What I also like is this area, where a land bridge is said to have been ages ago, and you can kind of see how this would fit together. The same can be said for the continents as a whole. You can imagine them kind of fitting together here. The only issue is that the western continent is so much more jagged in its coastlines, which makes a breaking off seem less plausible. However, who is to say plate tectonics work the same way or are even a thing in this world? I want to touch on the names really quick. I think they are really well done, with more English-sounding names in Westeros and more foreign or made-up sounding names the further east you go. It evokes a cultural setting for these places without even knowing anything about the story. The Lands of Always Winter is a name that has interested me about this world before I even read or watched anything about it. It makes me think of a place frozen in time almost, where old mysteries prevail that have otherwise long melted away. The names of the continents are somewhat uninspired, but again, so are names in our world. Australia just means southern in Latin, so I don't see why they can't name their continents after west and east, respectively. We still do the same when we talk about Western civilization or Orient and Occident. Overall, I think this is a great map, and the flaws it has still can be useful as shorthand for the viewer to recognize certain cultural or natural regions. I'm placing this in A. With a bit more originality on the shapes of things, it could easily be even higher. I really like this one, but is it better than Middle-earth? Subjectively, I would say yes, though it doesn't go into quite as much detail. I'm just going to say they're even for now. Next up is Skyrim, and this is our first map from a video game. It focuses on just the province of Skyrim, though the bordering provinces are hinted at by name. Just looking at the shape of it, it's not too inspired, very even to all sides, but at least the borders aren't straight enough to call it a square. It helps that we actually see all of the province, and it doesn't cut off in the east. We still have a coastline, but it's up north this time, which is a nice change up from our previous maps. Actually, this shape kind of reminds me of Switzerland, even more so if you turned it upside down. But it's not obvious enough to call this intentional, probably just a coincidence. The way it ranges down south here, with all the mountains too, kind of gives a weight to it all that prevents it from just looking like a big potato. In general, there are a lot of mountains, but they all look somewhat believable, with exception maybe of the throat of the world, which looks a bit lonely here. However, there are still some smaller hills scattered around it, which helps. It also points to the significance of this mountain and might hint at a divine creation rather than a natural development. I don't hold these things against fantasy maps, especially if there is an association with the divine in the lore, which is the case here. The mountains only leave room for a few plain areas, the biggest of which is Whiterun. To not make this look too empty, they put some little hills even here. The borders of the holds follow natural borders and rivers, but only roughly. Following Whiterun's borders, we can see they follow the mountains up north and to the west, but it gets a little muddy to the south, and to the east they don't follow the river perfectly either. This hints at a long history and borders that might have shifted through the ages as a consequence of war or diplomacy. Some of the symbols for the 9 holds serve as a good way of starting the process of imaginary world-building in the reader's head. For example, the sigil of the biggest plains is a horse, evoking images of warriors on horseback controlling these lands. Over in the most mountainous area, they have a mountain goat, enforcing the image of a very vertical, harsh place. Falkreath, with its rich hunting grounds, has a deer, and Morthal, with its inclination towards the occult, has something looking like a magic rune. The names work for the most part. Things like Riverwood might seem a bit uninspired again, since it is just a town at a river where they cut wood. But again, this is rather realistic, and I'm not personally bothered by it. There is a mixture of English words and fantasy words, and I think most hold up, though some of these sound a bit too made up. Design-wise, I have no complaints at all. I think everything looks very good, and the few colors used give a good contrast without sticking out too much. I especially love the old parchment look they were going for here. I like how certain aspects look a little worn out already, like this compass over here. Only then the question arises why nothing of the actual map over here looks anything close to that. I understand they didn't want it to mess with readability, but it does create a bit of a contradiction. For me, this map is great. I really like it a lot. The only issue I see with putting it next to these other maps up there is that it's far less detailed. There are no roads, and only a handful of towns shown here. They do show the hold borders and rivers, and I fear with any more lines or dots, this map would become too overloaded, so it is very good for what it's trying to be. Skyrim's map is definitely carried by its art style, and if that were to change, I would think far less highly of it. Because the world shown here really isn't that special. Forests and different biomes in general not being shown means it's giving less information than all the other world maps we've looked at so far. I'm really torn between A and B here. I'll put it in high B for now, simply because it's lacking both information and originality compared to these other maps in A, and I feel like I can't let my subjective taste for an art style score too many points here. That's me trying to be somewhat objective about this very subjective list, but if it was just about my feelings, this would go straight in A. Talking about it in this much detail has actually raised my appreciation for this map considerably. I would have never guessed I would think about putting it in A. Now for this one, we just zoom out a bit of Skyrim to look at all of Tamriel, the continent it lies on. There are different official maps for this one. A very popular version has all the provinces in different colors, like a modern political map would. While that is great for just looking at country sizes and borders, I wanted something feeling a little more fantasy, something that could belong in that world. So this one is also an official map, but it again goes for that kind of parchment look. I like this better, and from the compass down in the sea, you might get the idea that this is used for navigation, maybe by a merchant sailing these waters. Perhaps an important captain of the East Empire Trading Company? Anyways, this is not just a west coast, but a whole continent, which gets uniqueness points from me. Sadly, the shape is not unique or interesting at all. As so often, we are basically looking at a big square of land with some little bays chiseled out of it. There are a few interesting aspects I'd like to point out, though. Over here, we have Hammerfell and High Rock, which together roughly resemble Europe, with this part being Scandinavia and down here maybe being Italy. However, these are just vague associations, not copies of real land shapes like we've had before. We just talked about Skyrim, so I'm going to skip over it this time. Though now that we zoomed out, we see even less details. Over in Morrowind, we have this volcanic island, which is an interesting addition. It makes me wonder, though, why was there a perfectly shaped bay before this island emerged from the ocean? This might look less designed if we cut out this peninsula entirely. In the heartland of the Empire, we have this island in the middle of it, which I like. I think it almost symbolizes the heart of the Empire as its capital. We then get this river going down into the ocean, and while I like the way it looks, either this is an enormous river or the continent isn't very big at all. Of course, this could be artistic license or just an in-universe inaccuracy on the cartographer's end. But the way this looks, you might rather think the sea is going all the way till here, and this all being seawater. We have Somerset Isle, which is actually 2 islands, kind of like Great Britain and Ireland. These two look like they would somewhat fit together and might have split off. You could also speculate that maybe the isle as a whole was once connected to the mainland over here, though this is far less clear to me. Talking about names, I again like the mixture of English and fantasy words. Sadly, we get even less details in this map, with only the names of the provinces and some of the biggest cities being labeled. We do get some forests now and learn that Skyrim apparently just doesn't have any. Maybe this only covers deep jungles. Overall, the details like mountains and trees look a little washed out, and with not much else going on here, I think they could have benefited from some stronger lines. Unfortunately, there's not many exciting things happening on this map, and some of the more interesting places create some questions that aren't really explained anywhere. So rather than make you look for answers in the lore, this just makes you look for explanations outside of it. Overall, this map is okay, but nothing more. This is another map that might not be fair to compare to the others. It's not a world map, not even one of a country, but rather shows one main place of the story, namely Hogwarts from Harry Potter. This one is inspired by a drawing J.K. Rowling did herself. However, it does change some directions around, so it might not be entirely accurate. Still, these are the ones printed in the books I own. I think it does a good job orientating the reader within this place and helping them know what is where. For example, I always had trouble picturing where the big lake on the school grounds fit in, and this does help. I like the little squid in it, which, compared to the castle, is actually a very big squid, but still I think it's cute. The boats let you know the route first years take, and this way here lets you follow the older students into the school. The important places are all mentioned here, and they're done fine. I'm not sure these placements always line up perfectly with the story, but I'm not sure they're supposed to either. This feels more like a concept map than one that is super detailed. Still, I think it would have been cool to not only show the grounds outside, but also have a peek into the castle itself, either on a second map or maybe on this one. I always wanted an official one for the books, but this isn't it, unfortunately. Instead, we just get this generic fantasy castle. Still, for what it wants to be, this is a good map. It gives you the general locations of everything and has enough personality to let your mind fill in the gaps. It goes in B for me, and while some Wheel of Time fans might be scratching their heads, or worse, wanting to displace my head from my neck, ultimately this just looks better to me and does what it wants in a good way. Next, we're looking at the map from the inheritance cycle centered around the story of Eragon. Once again, we have a west coast and a square of land that goes further into the east, so far so basic. I really don't vibe with the way the mountains are drawn here, unfortunately. They look like they're almost too three-dimensional, in a kind of plastic fake way. The trees I like better, but they don't stick out to me as great either. They're passable, though. We see one island that looks kind of like an animal footprint, maybe even a dragon claw, which is kind of fun, but that's about it for fun on this map. Some of the names are good, but a lot of them seem almost too fantasy, too made up, too cliché. This is hard to talk about objectively, and if they work for you, then I can't argue with that. But to me, a lot of them seem forced. The geography is very one-dimensional. We either have mountains or a desert or woodland and very little else. It seems like the map is just split into 3 biomes, and that's it. I kind of like these lonely little hills in the desert. The desert itself I'm split on. On the one hand, it seems so out of place to just have this big desert in the middle of nowhere. On the other hand, that's kind of intriguing to me. Maybe there's a divine or magical reason for this. It gets my mind thinking, and I like that. Still, it doesn't help me get over the fact that this just feels video gamey, like one area is desert, one is mountainous. Oh, we also need a forest and maybe some grassland with a river going through it. It feels like a checklist almost, where the protagonists can go through each of these and overcome them. But does it feel real? Not really. And that feeling of unrealness could be a theme of the world, or even a plot point, and then it might work. But as far as I know, it's not, and that just leaves me feeling empty looking at this. Like a diversity checklist in Overwatch or a bedroom made up entirely of IKEA furniture, it serves its purpose, but it doesn't feel purposeful. I could give this a low C, but honestly, looking at what else is in that tier, I think I'll have to drop it in D. And I think that's fair. I do think this is a rather bad map. I enjoyed the books, but looking at this map gives me this uneasy feeling of dread that I don't think was intended at all. Next up, we have the Final Empire from the Mistborn series. Looking just at this artwork as a whole, I love it. It looks almost like an hourglass with these 2 circles. There are symbols that have meaning in the story, and I like this unique way of placing the text. Now, looking on the map itself, we once again have a west coast of a larger land area, and it looks kind of square. We do have this bigger bay here at least. The names aren't very inspired. I think even in the real world, people usually come up with a bit more interesting of a name. Having 1 or 2 of these named in this fashion would be fine, but all of them except the Terrace Mountains? That's a bit too much even for me. Southern, Western, Eastern, Remote, these names do indicate one thing, though. that the people in charge seem not to care about unique cultural or natural differences between these regions and only think of them as in how they are placed from the central dominance. I like the word central dominance here because it's not just a placeholder for province, but also implies actual dominion over the other areas. Insofar, this could be seen as world building, and that does line up with the story. It feels almost dystopian and authoritarian, less like a typical fantasy, which fits the world. There's not much more details here, apart from some cities and important places. Overall, I still think this is a good map. The unique way of portraying it helps it a lot. Still, the lack of detail makes it hard to be compared to a lot of the other maps on this list. It goes in the bottom of B for me. Now, this is a city map, and this city is the capital of the world we just looked at. Again, it's kept in just black and white, but it looks a lot more detailed. We see every little street and the main roads, too. The general districts are named, and so are all the gates leading into the city. I think it's interesting that they're all named after metals. Obviously, these play a role in the story, too. But even ignoring that, I think it's an interesting choice. It makes you wonder, are those gates actually made out of these metals? Maybe they hold special importance in the culture, or these are trading routes. Maybe they have a symbolic meaning. For example, steel could hint at weapons and war. It makes you think, which I always like. We see all the big roads leading to this main point here, which marks it as a very important place, maybe the seat of power. Very close to it are also various headquarters, marked by these X's here, which helps to further reinforce this impression. The river dividing the city in two halves is not the most unique, but I still like it. It creates images of wild chases over bridges and through dark alleyways. It also gives me Victorian London vibes, with a lot of mist and even a bit of a Gothic atmosphere. The black and white helps these impressions further. I think that this not only fits the story well, but is also great on its own. I like the symbol right in the heart of the city here. It hints at some lore, as do these symbols up in the corner here. We've seen these on the previous map, too. I think this map looks great at a first glance, and it mostly holds up under close inspection. The black and white works visually for me, however it can make reading some of these notes a little hard. They blend in with the houses and streets a little too much. The bigger font doesn't have this issue, but for the smaller words it's not ideal. I'm not sure if making these a different color would work though, because the visual style this map is going for is very strong, and making these red, for example, would probably stick out too much. We again have a fairly even mass in all directions, but since this is a city and not a continent, that makes a lot of sense. You can imagine the city having some starting point at the center, probably close to the river, and roughly expanding equally from there. I think it would make more sense for the bigger half to be on the side of the seat of power here, but there are reasons for the opposite to be true, like in this case. For example, the bigger but poorer part where the peasants would live might be over here, and the high society, which makes up a smaller part of total population, could have their own exclusive district on the other side. Now, that's not really the case on this map. The housings of nobility are scattered on both sides of the river, but there could be other reasons for this uneven divide. Overall, I like this map a lot, and even though I voiced quite a few complaints, all of them are minor ones. This map is not perfect, but I think it's great, so into A it goes. I will put it at the very bottom of A because it can't really compete with the scale of these bigger maps in here, nor is it as flawless at what it's trying to do as the Hobbit map was. Still, a great map. And that's our final tier list, or my final tier list, I should say. I hope you're not too mad at me, but if you are, feel free to tell me about it in the comments. Thanks for sticking around till the end. Maybe I will see you in another video someday.